Over the last year or so, I've talked about how director Denis Villeneuve might go about adapting certain scenes from the Dune Messiah book in Dune Part 3, whether that be the Stoneburner scene or even the Holy War sequences. But I haven't talked about how he might go about bringing the very end of his final film to life and what changes he might make so that the ending is the most impactful it can be on the big screen. So in this video, I'm going to be discussing just that. There will be big spoilers from the ending of Dune Messiah in this video, so if you haven't read Frank Herbert's novel yet, then I'd recommend watching one of my other videos on the upcoming Dune film instead. Before I get into it though, if you want to keep up to date on any of my future content surrounding Dune Part 3, then don't forget to support this upload by giving it a like rating, subscribing to the channel, and turning on your notifications. But without further ado, let's discuss the potential ending scenes from Dune Part 3. So starting with the Dune Messiah book, what actually happens during the ending of that book and what is the meaning of it? Well, starting with the confrontation between Paul and Scytale, the moment unfolds like the tightening of a noose, a moment where every thread of conspiracy, prophecy and personal tragedy converges into a single room. By the time Scytale steps forward, Paul is already a man stripped down to the last of his certainties. Having just survived a Stoneburner attack that physically blinded him, Paul has been navigating his world through the rigid, inescapable tracks of his prescient visions. However, the birth of his twins, Leto II and Ganima, creates a catastrophic blind spot in his sight. The vision he had followed so precisely suddenly terminates, leaving him truly blind in a room with a shape-shifting assassin who holds the ultimate leverage over him, using the deceased body of his beloved Charlie against him. The face dancer says to him that the Tleilaxu can create a Gola of Chani, restoring her to life with her memories intact, but only if Paul abdicates his throne, dismantles his religious empire, and surrenders his holdings to the Bene Tleilax. This is the moment where Frank Herbert lays bare the agonizing burden of Muad'Dib. Paul is tempted by the one thing he has always wanted in life, with Chani free from the dictates of destiny, but he recognizes the trap. To accept the Gola would be to surrender his people to the Tleilaxu and subject Chani to becoming a perpetual and manufactured puppet. Scytale represents the ultimate subversion of nature and identity, mocking Paul's godhood by offering a synthetic imitation of love in exchange for absolute political submission. The tension then gets high when Scytale realizes that Paul is hesitating, and so he shifts his threat to the newborn twins, holding a crysknife at their throats. Because Paul is entirely blind, his newborn son Leto II uses his own genetic memory and preborn awareness to project his visual field directly into his father's mind. And then in a sequence of shared consciousness, Paul experiences a vivid psychic overlay, seeing the room through the eyes of his infant son lying there in the cradle. This shared perspective bypasses the failure of Paul's own prescience. And by being armed with this instant clarity, Paul's able to hurl a crysknife across the room with pinpoint accuracy, striking Scytale and ending the Tleilaxu threat. So this confrontation is the thematic pivot in the entire Dune saga. By killing Scytale and refusing the Gola of Chani, Paul rejects the path of a stagnant, predictable universe controlled by calculation and genetic blackmail. But it's also known that while he saves his children, Paul further recognizes that his son Leto possesses a terrifying, far grander capacity for prescience, one that will eventually lead to the brutal Golden Path. So while Paul has survived the assassination plot, we learn that the victory of that has a downside too. The Fremen expect their Messiah to rise stronger, but Paul knows he cannot continue. So the only escape for him is to walk into the desert blind as Fremen tradition demands. He does this to reject his godlike status, abdicate his oppressive empire, and free himself from his inescapable future. Before he does leave though, Paul confronts the political wreckage left behind. He names Aliyah as regent and acknowledges the twins as his heirs. He also rejects Princess Irulan's attempts at reconciliation, though he does not punish her, and he refuses to let the Fremen turn Chani's death into another holy symbol. All of these scenes unfold with a quiet, mournful way, as Paul is no longer the charismatic leader, as he is a man exhausted by destiny and stripped of everything that must come next. He knows that by walking into the desert, he is both fulfilling and rejecting prophecy, becoming a martyr to the Fremen while simultaneously escaping the prescient path that has trapped him for years. And when we then come to the final chapter of the Dune Messiah book, the perspective shifts to Alia, who is now burdened with the weight of regency and the legacy of her brother's impossible life. She meets with Haight, who's now Duncan Idaho again, conversing in a quiet and intimate scene that serves as the emotional epilogue of the entire novel. The awakening of Duncan's original consciousness overrides his Tleilaxu conditioning, allowing him to regain his full identity and resume his loyal service to House Atreides. We further learn here that Alia is torn between grief, responsibility, and a strange unsettling awareness of her own pre-born consciousness. And with Duncan being restored but changed, stands as both a reminder of the past and a symbol of the uncertain future. The conversation in the final chapter is gentle but charged, filled with unspoken questions about identity, loyalty, and the shape of the world Paul has left behind. And it's in this moment that Alia reveals her vulnerability, and Duncan offers her something she never truly had. And that is a level of understanding without judgment. This is something that Paul didn't really experience too much of, especially with there being the signs of him being the Kwisatz Haderach. So ultimately, we learn that Dune Messiah ends not with triumph, but with a sense of fragile continuity. Paul is gone, but his children live. The Jihad has reshaped the galaxy, but the future remains open. Alia and Duncan stand at the threshold of a new political order, one built on the ruins of Paul's impossible reign. And in the silence that follows Paul's departure, the story leaves us with a final lingering truth. And that is that the Messiah has fallen, but the consequences of his rise and his sacrifice will echo for generations to come. So when Denis Villeneuve reaches the ending of Dune Part 3, he will be adapting not just the final chapters of Dune Messiah, but the emotional culmination of everything he has built across 3 films. And because the director is typically after an approach that makes for the best possible ending for a modern and cinematic adaptation of the material, I think like we saw with the other films he's made, the ending will not just be a strict recreation of Herbert's text, but it will adapt to the big moments and ultimately get to the heart of what the ending is saying narratively. Essentially, I think it will be a cinematic translation of the book's emotional truth. The confrontation with Scytale, Paul's final walk into the desert, and the quiet epilogue between Alia and Haight will all be reshaped to fit the visual grammar and thematic arcs that Villeneuve has been constructing since Part 1. And I think the result will be an ending that feels faithful to Herbert's tragedy, but expressed through Villeneuve's own language of imagery, silence, and mythic scale. So coming to the start of those ending sequences, I think the Paul-Scytale confrontation will most likely be driven by suspense. I can see Villeneuve staging it as a mostly long, unbroken take, letting the tension in the moment build in real time. The camera can stay close to Paul's face, emphasizing his blindness, his stillness, and the terrifying calm he maintains, while Scytale holds his child hostage. If Villeneuve keeps his stylistic flair, I can also see the lighting being stark and directional, capturing the deep shadows and silhouettes of those in the room to create a visual language that feels more like the closing moments of Sicario. I can further see Villeneuve using silence as a weapon here too. Essentially, little to no score and just the conversation and tense movements of both Paul and Scytale. The suspense will come from the audience knowing that Paul cannot see, yet somehow he becomes able to see. Moving on, when it comes to one of the significant changes I could see after this confrontation, I see it coming in the scenes leading up to Paul's departure. In the book, these chapters are dense with political detail, with the naming of heirs, the settling of conspiracies, and the shifting of power. And I think Villeneuve will ultimately streamline this. He could focus on the central emotional beats in Paul grieving Charlie, him rejecting Irulan's attempts at redemption, him naming Aaliyah as regent, and him realising that his prescient path has ended. I essentially think that the political mechanics of the moments leading up to the very last scene will be compressed into a few sharp symbolic moments. I see them primarily being shaped around Paul's internal collapse and not the external machinery of the Imperium. And then when we finally get to Paul's desert walk at the very end, I think this could become the most precise cinematic moment of the entire trilogy. In the book, Paul makes his final walk into the desert, and then the story wraps up with a final chapter between Aaliyah and Duncan. But I think that Villeneuve might invert this slightly. I think that this final sequence will begin with Paul walking into the desert, framed as a kind of tragic visual mirror to the moment in Dune Part 1 when he first touched the sands during the Spice Harvester sequence and felt the future opening before him on Arrakis. In Part 1, the sand in that moment represented possibility in his prescience and a form of awakening. And in Part 3, it could then represent the end of that possibility, the moment where Paul steps out of the prescient path entirely. I think he could also echo a similar framing, with the sound design and even the posture of Paul's body reflecting that harvester scene, creating a visual rhyme across the trilogy. The most powerful change I could see the director making here though is the idea that while Paul does not see any visions during this final walk, the audience does so instead. In the earlier films and during the Harvester sequence, Paul's visions were subjective and we saw what he saw. But in this final moment, Paul's prescience has ended. So the visions of the future that the audience could get with glimpses of Leto and Ghanima, and perhaps even early hints at Leto II's transformation, would not be Paul's visions. They would be the film's visions and the universe's visions, a way of showing the audience that the story continues even though Paul's part in it is over. It's important to note that grown-up Leto and Ghanima have been cast in the film, with Ida Brooke playing Ghanima and Nakoa Wolf Momoa playing Leto II. So I think this could be exactly the kind of mythic, poetic gesture that Villeneuve could use to close his film, with images that show the impact Paul had on the future even as his journey ends. Another thing I wanted to mention is that I think there could also be cross-cutting during this final sequence, interweaving Paul's desert walk with the final conversation between Aaliyah and Hay. Villeneuve loves parallel editing to create emotional resonance between scenes. In Blade Runner 2049, he cross-cutted Kay's death with Deckard meeting his daughter. In Arrival, he intercutted Louise's present with visions of her future child. So I think it's entirely plausible that Villeneuve could intercut Paul's final steps into the dunes with Aaliyah's quiet, intimate conversation with Duncan from the end of Dune Messiah. And ultimately, doing that would tell the story of the book's ending and its central meaning clearly. You'd have Paul stepping out of the world and Aaliyah stepping into power. You'd have Paul losing the last of his humanity and Duncan regaining his. And you'd have Paul's story ending with a suggestion of the twin story beginning much later. So cross-cutting this would allow Villeneuve to create a tapestry of endings and beginnings and a visual poem about legacy and consequence. Something else I wanted to add on at the end is that I think there could also be changes to Aaliyah's ending, with the final intercut moments between her and Duncan being framed not just as a political epilogue, but as the beginning of Aaliyah's own downfall. Maybe we get subtle hints of the inner voices, the preborn consciousness, or just a small seed of Children of Dune for the book fans. So I do think that there is a slight chance that he could plant the emotional foundation for what comes next using her character. As a whole though, it will be interesting to see what he does with the ending, and I do think the final scenes can have a nice sense of visual poetry to them. And again, I think that Villeneuve will use cross-cutting and add to the ending with visions of the future, making them as impactful as possible. But that was my video discussing how Denis Villeneuve might adapt the ending of Dune Part 3. How do you think the director will go about bringing the ending of Dune Messiah to the big screen, and what changes do you see him making in his adaptation? Let me know down below in the comments section. For much more videos and breakdowns, then subscribe to the channel and turn on your notifications. Also, if you enjoyed this video, remember to leave a like rating and follow me on social media via the links in the description. But anyway, I hope you guys enjoyed it. I've been Cortex, and as always, make some noise.